of Rutgers University. The ground rules are simple, roughly 20 minutes for each speaker. I'll enforce this liberally but firmly, and so that we have plenty of time for conversation and interchange among the panelists and with the audience at the end of the formal talks. Professor Jones.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a symptom of how conflicted the relationship between Luther and psychology is and has been that I must begin by saying what I am not going to do. Despite his depression and self-confessed inner torment, I am not going to treat Luther as an example of psychopathology. And I have two sections in this paper about why I'm not going to do that, which I'm going to skip over in the interest of time. Like many larger-than-life figures, he was a man often at the mercy of overwhelming appetites. He was a person of extremes. He went from the extreme of scrupulosity and asceticism to moments of extreme indulgence in food, drink, and speech. He also had a powerful fixation on his bodily processes, which he could describe in excruciating detail. And like many polemicists, he could articulate his own position best by saying what he was against. He needed opposition to feel alive. All of this makes him a fascinating and complicated human being. None of it makes him necessarily sick. So I will not be putting Dr. Luther on Dr. Freud's or Dr. Jones's couch. Quite the reverse. Given his conflicted and psychologically ambiguous character, it is a tribute to Luther's psychological strength and resilience that he was able to use his conflicts, torments, and volcanic emotions in the service of a creative and constructive theological project. Luther acknowledged this when he wrote, "Living, yea, dying, and being damned is what makes a theologian, not thinking, reading, or speculating." I often wish some of my colleagues in theology felt that way. It is some of the creative connections between his psychological situation and his theological formulations that I want to comment on. I will be listening for some of the psycho-religious themes in Luther's writings and what little we know of his life history. And hopefully I will allow myself to be addressed by Luther as well as addressing him from within the perspective of psychology. The first theme I want to talk about I call turning a wrathful God into a loving God. While he battled with princes in the political realm, with theologians in the intellectual realm, and with God and the devil in the spiritual realm, Luther appears convinced that the most fundamental site of battle is within the human soul. Locating the primary site of personal struggle within the self is certainly something the psychoanalyst can affirm. Probably the most significant theological psychological transformation Luther accomplished was turning a wrathful God experience into a loving God experience. It is a commonplace observation that Luther's early life was consumed by a guilty conscience and the concomitant dread of a wrathful and punitive God. A first-hand experience with a tormenting conscience and a punitive God of wrath and judgment comes through clearly in Luther's meditations on the Passion, where he argues that Christ's suffering is a necessary price for our sins, a traditional theme heavy with psychological and theological meaning. Such a view rests on an image of God as just and punitive, but also loving and forgiving. But God's justice and righteous anger are in the foreground here, and his love and forgiveness in the background. God's love and mercy are obscured by his outrage at transgression, his need for vengeance, and his vindictive anger. This theology also rests upon a view of humanity as consisting of disobedient transgressors, with eternal damnation as their deserved and inescapable fate. To internalize such a theology, one must be brought to the felt realization of the full extent of his or her sinfulness. This Luther does masterfully by being able to transform his own experience of torment into many a homiletical tour de force. In this theological world, the emphasis falls almost entirely on guilt and the weight of disobedience. The self is haunted by what the British psychoanalyst W.R.D. Fairbairn calls an internal saboteur. In this case, a tormenting conscience. To its endless demands and sacrifices must be offered, penalties paid, purifications undertaken. Clinically, this way of experiencing the self and others and God is almost always associated with depression and obsessive-compulsive scrupulosity. This certainly reminds one both of Luther's scrupulosity as a monk and of the melancholy that dogged him all of his days. Luther's writings lay bare the psychology behind this theology. A burden of guilt is the psychological soil out of which grows this way of understanding the work of Christ as a sacrifice, as an expiation of God's justice, and the requirement that transgressions be punished severely. If the soul does not naturally feel such a burden, as Luther apparently naturally did, it must be brought to feel this burden by rhetorical power. To be psychologically effective, this theology requires an internal conflict be experienced between the self and its conscience. Here again, Luther could serve as a paradigm. If it can be appropriated psychologically and experientially, then the work of Christ will bring relief from the burden of guilt by paying the price needed to satisfy God's wrath. But psychologically, that is the crucial question. Can such a juridical transaction be appropriated experientially? Or more precisely, what are the psychological preconditions for being able to appropriate it, or else that make that experientially impossible? Here again, Luther can serve as an example. Strikingly, for Luther, this theology of the wrathful and vindictive God is not the end of the story, either personally or theologically. His meditations on the Passion follows the Holy Week trajectory, moving from the torture of Good Friday to the glory of Easter. The 14th consolations follow the same deep structure. The first 7 consolations are negative and involve meditating on 7, quotes, evils found in human life. The second 7 are positive and involve meditating on second, quotes, blessings. Here we meditate on the glorified Christ and see there an example of God's love. Psychologically speaking, a figure ground shift has taken place. At first, God's judgment was the foreground, his mercy in the background. Now his mercy is in the foreground and his judgment is the background. Christ now radiates love rather than provoking us to fear. Christ is now a figure of beneficence whose love for us motivates us to identify with him and serve him out of love, not terror. Psychologically, we have moved from fear into love, from terror into desire, from Christ as judge to Christ as ideal. But there's not only been a change in the image of God, a God of wrath replaced by a God of love, but also a change in our understanding of human nature. What we might call Luther's Good Friday theology assumed that at most humanity could be educated through punishment and external behavior modified through fear. Now there's a suggestion that humanity might be motivated by gratitude and be able to internalize an example of love. The possibility of a more internal transformation is hinted at. The human problem has shifted from dealing with a punitive conscience to facilitating a transformation of the self. Luther, of course, describes this change in theological, not psychological terms, as an embrace of a doctrine of justification by faith, and to that we now turn briefly. The psychologist prefers to begin from experience and move from there to reflection. So I begin this discussion of the psychological themes in Luther's theory of justification by faith with the experience in this so-called tower that led Luther to this theology. I assume I don't have to read that out, that everybody here is familiar with it. Besides, I don't have the time to do that. Not surprisingly, we have the same thematic structure observed before. Luther starts with fear and punishment and moves to grace and mercy. This move is driven by his realization that the term righteousness of God can refer not to God's anger, but to God's merciful willingness to accept our, quotes, faith in Christ in lieu of our ability to earn or merit God's favor. In theory, all of this activity is done by God. All we have to do is believe it's true. Psychologically, Luther is feeling powerless. His works have not worked to salve his conscience. Clinicians know that such a strategy of works never works. You can never do enough to satisfy a demanding conscience. That psychological reality is at the core of Luther's doctrine. Luther embraces this experience of powerlessness, affirming that there is nothing we can do. The acceptance of this reality of powerlessness to salve his tormenting conscience opens up the possibility of a new perspective. I cannot do it, but I do not have to do it. Christ has done it for me. The key to the Christian life for Luther then becomes the ability to say, I believe this is true, or I trust that it is true. So psychologically, Luther's theology can be understood as an expression and an artful response to a certain psychological condition, the tormenting conscience, and the concomitant inability to do anything to satisfy it. Let me be clear that such an analysis is not to reduce Luther's theology to a psychopathology, but rather to offer an appreciation of what he has achieved psychologically out of his own inner resilience and resources. It does, however, leave me with 3 questions that I will conclude with. First, one of the dynamics involved with the tormenting conscience is anger. Being constantly criticized from within and without inevitably makes a person furious. And feelings of passivity and helplessness can also potentiate and exacerbate feelings of rage. Often that anger is turned back against the self. Hence the connection between such a conscience and depression. Depression understood as anger turned against the self. Luther's solution of shifting the problem and its solution onto God relieves his inner torment, at least to some extent, to the extent that he can accept and believe after the cross that God does not really condemn him. But it does nothing to deal with the problem of anger. Luther himself acknowledges this. I am free from avarice, my body and my age and bodily weakness protect me from sexual desire, and I am not afflicted with hate and envy. Up to now, only anger remains in me. If this anger is no longer projected against the self, where does it go? The answer seems clear. It's projected onto the Jews, the peasants, the Catholic Church, etc., and etc. Psychologically speaking, Luther's polemical writings are not simply the ravings of a grumpy old man. They are the price paid for Luther's solution to the theology of a wrathful God and a punitive conscience. And since a sub-theme of this panel is the connection between religion and violence, a theology which still contains within it the representation of a punitive God of wrath, an image of God associated with violent religions, and which offers no way to transform anger, may not be helpful in breaking the connection between religion and violence. Second, Luther's distress exemplifies what the Hungarian-American psychoanalyst from here in Chicago, Heinz Kohut, calls guilty man, the person characterized by what Freud would call a punitive superego. This was the typical patient in Freud's practice. For different reasons, interestingly enough, both Luther and Freud considered this character structure, the guilty man, the tormenting conscience, as the universal condition. But is that the case? Empirically, the answer would appear to be no. Kohut also describes what he calls tragic man, the person who suffers less from a tormenting conscience and more from a weak and diffused sense of self. Such people often feel empty and disconnected. Their lives often feel diffuse and protean. They seem unable to make lasting commitments. Many times they over-idealize another person, ideology, or institution, and then fall into a rage when their over-idealizations are disappointed. Such people are less in need of a more forgiving and accepting God representation and more in need of a solid and empathically experiential relationship. Reports from the clinical field suggest, and this is certainly my experience, that while patients tormented by punitive superego are still seen, more and more one encounters patients with a more diffused and empty sense of self. For them, a theology of sacrificial expiation and divine forgiveness will have less and less psychological relevance and transforming power, regardless of how hard they believe it intellectually. Does Luther's theology contain some resources that might address the psychological problem of the diffused self with as much power as it addresses the psychological problem of the guilty conscience, even though that was not the context in which the theology was originally formulated? I should leave that question to the Lutheran theologians here, but I will offer one suggestion in the form of a question. Must Luther's theology follow the same trajectory as his development did? That is, must it begin with the wrathful God and the guilty conscience, and then move from there to the God Christ of mercy? Or can it go directly to or start from the Christ of mercy? I ask that because it is the merciful Christ, not the wrathful God, that the diffused self can connect with. Or to put it another way, the psychological situation of the diffused self longing for an empathic other cries out for the merciful God and the Christ who shared the vicissitudes of our life, rather than the sacrificial victim that purchases our freedom from a tormenting conscience. I was going to read a quote, a very moving quote from Luther's Meditation on Christ's Passion, but I don't have the time, but that would illustrate what I'm talking about. But there is an image of God that, if embraced, might catalyze the transformation of the self, the image of the loving Christ, identifying with the loving Christ. Last, third, and final question. As Luther would say, it all depends on faith. But what are the psychological preconditions and ramifications of the kind of faith Luther calls for? Luther says, faith justifies not as a work, or as a quality, or as knowledge, but as assent of the will and firm confidence in the mercy of God. It is assent. And I have quote after quote after quote that illustrates the same point. But is this really a solution to the problem of the tormenting conscience and the concomitant depression? The answer for Luther is ambiguous at best. Much of Luther's table talk portrays a lifelong struggle with melancholy. When describing the necessity of holding fast to God's proclamation of forgiveness, Luther reports towards the end of his life, I preach to others what I cannot do myself. And Erickson reports that towards the end of his life, Luther required people to constantly remind him that God forgave him, and even to shout the Lord's Prayer in his ear, to drown out his demonic inner voices. As Luther himself says, it is very difficult for a man to believe that God is gracious to him. The human heart cannot grasp this. What is the problem here? In the Tower, Luther had a profound experiential realization of the truth of justification by faith. But as William James pointed out, such transforming moments are always transitory. That by itself, a powerful conversion experience and a realization of the truth of the human condition produced little lasting transformation is no surprise at all to the clinician. We should not blame Luther's theology for his continued suffering. The problem is psychological, not theological. Luther has the theology right, but psychologically speaking, assenting to truth claims, however true they may be, is rarely, if ever, transformative or curative by itself. It is commonplace to hear patients say, I understand my problem. I know where it came from. How irrational it is to think and feel this way, but I still suffer. Agreement, understanding, assent are pretty powerless in the face of deep-seated, often unconscious, emotional currents, habits of mind, wishes, and fears. In my experience, both clinically and spiritually, it is not faith in the sense of thinking or assenting, but rather experience and disciplined practice that catalyzes lasting psychological and religious transformation. Given the ingrained suspicion of anything that smells of justification by works, could Lutheran spirituality incorporate into itself this doctor's prescription for a life of disciplined spiritual practice as the primary means of internalizing and deepening the truth of justification by faith? I leave you with that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jones, for a talk that was not only a model of insight, but also of conciseness. Our next speaker is Professor Volker Lappin from the Universität Jena.
Ladies and gentlemen, Luther research, especially in Germany, seems to be somehow terrified by Eric H. Erickson's psychoanalysis of young man Luther until now. This might have caused difficulties in bringing Luther's religious education and his later theological doctrine into relation. But we should not be frightened in this. Rather we should look how we can do this in a responsible manner. This cannot work by means of dogmatic only, and so we should avoid interpreting all that we read in Luther with dogmatic concepts. It could be a better way for understanding Luther to think in imageries, what means to look how the imagery of God that learned child and young man Luther changed and perhaps partly remained in the older one. First, Luther's religious education. We do not know much about Luther's religious education, but we do have some hints. First of all, we have to realize that Luther speaks so harmlessly of the catechism as his own children's teaching that he still has to learn as an adult, that it would be difficult to understand this not in the way that he indeed learned this by his own parents, meaning there was an at least basic religious education including the 10 Commandments, the Creed, and the Paternoster. To ensure this, one has to remember the Father scene at Luther's first Mass. Having conducted the whole service with all well-known difficulties, Luther witnessed his father being asked by his new brothers why he had wanted to prevent his sons joining the convent. There, the father enraged again and cried, "Did you not hear that it is said you should honor your parents?" Historically, this means that for the father it was a matter of course to know the 10 Commandments, which allows us to assume that this was part of what he gave his son in the religious education. This alone does not suffice to draw a picture of the special religious atmosphere in the house of Paul Luther. It might show us as somehow lawful thinking spoken in later Lutheran terms. What seems to be more significant in the same context of the struggle between father and son about Luther's way into the order is the father's potential interpretation of the event of Stotternheim. He asked his son if he were sure that this was not just the devil's play. There, we have a strong line of Luther's later spirituality, which as it seems stems from his father's house. The conviction, if not obsession, of the devil being present in the whole life as an aggressor and temptator. Indeed, Luther himself interprets his whole life from his childhood on as a struggle with the devil. And he reports us that the devil gave him tranquility for just 1 year after entering the order, what does not mean any other than that he felt the devil's power before this time very hard. There, we seem to come back indeed to the imagery of the parents' spirituality, and perhaps we can go one step further. It was not only the devil who threatened the young man Luther, but it was also Christ himself, who seems not to have been a strong counterpart to the devil, but a menacing person as well. We are used to understand Luther's reformatory development as a quarrel with his monastic life, and within this framework that needs a dark monastic time to enlighten the time after. Luther's research has omitted to follow the hints given by Luther himself that show that some of his heart spirituality does not root in the monastery, but in the time before, and that even the monastery gave help to overcome this, even if Luther could not use this fully in those years. Indeed, looking back in his late commentary on the Galatians in the 30s, Luther states that he had learned from his youth on to be frightened by the name of Christ because he was used to understand him only as the great judge. And in another context, he even compares this fear of Christ with the fear of the devil. And, what is interesting in the context of the above-mentioned lawful education he passed over, he combines it both in the picture of Jesus Christ as judge asking me if I followed the 10 Commandments. There we get the whole panorama of his childhood's religion, a threatening Christ together with a threatening devil, and both hold together by the human being's duty to fulfill the commandments. That is the parents', not the monastery's spiritual world that we hear in this. This is shown by some other accounts of Luther. As early as in the first years in his monastery, the master of the young monks in his monastery tried to explain him that the right attitude against God was hope, not fear. How often and deep also John of Staupitz repeated this positive way to God is very well known. All this underlines that it was the heritage of the parental house that Luther took with himself when he saw Jesus Christ as an awesome judge, and it was this heritage that was a burden for his whole life. Now, I will skip my second chapter dealing with Luther's reformatory discovery that is too well known to spread it largely here. The only two things I want to say here are first, indeed, Luther got a warm image of a freeing God in developing his reformatory theology in the years up to 1520. And second, this was not a hard break with medieval theology and piety, but it was encouraged and indeed initiated by John of Staupitz, who has, as Luther stated later, begun the doctrine. This means the doctrine, or as I better want to say, the image of a loving and freeing God, was begun by John of Staupitz. Having this in mind, I jump directly to my third chapter, the lasting ambivalence, the beloved God punishing human beings. The ambivalence, pointed out in this subtitle, can be worked out in two ways, and indeed Luther used both. The one way is to project the hard sides on another power than God himself. The other way is to split off somehow God himself, and the second way, again, has two variants. The first means to split off God's actions, the second to split off God ontologically. Looking on the first way, there's not just one bad power outside of God in Luther's thinking, but an entire group of powers, the devil, the Antichrist, and notoriously the Jews. The three are not fully separated, but distinguished. While the devil seems to part of the baggage Luther took from his parents' house, Antichrist and also the Jews seem to have come into his world scenario as a result of his new reformatory theology. This means, first of all, there's obviously one power working against God, which Luther learned to know in the spirituality of his father's home and never got rid of, the devil himself. He, the devil, was a reality in his religious education and remained a reality over his whole life. This means that life of human being for Luther stood in the midst between God and devil. The most famous image for this is human being as riding animal in De Servo Arbitrio. There's no place for human being where he is not ridden by anyone, God or devil. And if we take this image alone, the end seems to be open. There's no hint for a final triumph of God looking on the human individual. Devil, seen as this, is a permanent threatening for human's life, as he seems to have been in Luther's religious education. This does not mean that this satanic reality did not pass special transformations in Luther's thinking. Indeed, it did. The devil did not only remain a personal counterpart of God, but he won a special weapon in Luther's thinking to rule human beings, the sin, working within men and women to lead them in devils instead of God's kingdom. We do not know exactly how Paul and Margarete Luther's image of the devil looked like, but what we see in Luther's combination of sin and devil seems to be rooted so deeply in his theology of justification that it gives reason to identify this as the reformatory framework of his teaching of the devil. Even more than in this case, in case of Antichrist and the Jews, Luther developed images of fear and threatening by his reformatory insights. To identify the papacy as the Antichrist meant an image of fear and threatening immigrating into the church itself. In contradiction or addition to the image of Christ as loving and freeing instead of causing fear, the cause for fear still remained in the religious order of his world, now not at the heaven, but rather in the earthly representatives of God, the popes. The fear, set out of the image of God himself in some way, went back into the church in a harsh way, and it maintained connected with the devil as Luther's late and cruel track on the papacy endowed by the devil shows. In some way, psychologically, it suggests itself to think here for a theological handling of Luther's religious experience. His way, started within the medieval church, had brought him not only to the confidence into a loving God, but also to an absolutely negative view on all exterior instances of the church of his days. So, whatever could have been threatening was now projected on these ecclesiastical powers, so that they themselves got the most violent religious image that one could assign with the world, while the devil himself came from outside of the human world. His endowment, the Antichrist, took part within this world and was the cruelest power herein, sitting in the midst of the church. While Luther, with this, clearly distinguished his own party from the other side, he also took up the concept of Antichrist to give common fears an expression when he differentiated the spiritual Antichrist, meaning the papacy, from the carnal one, the Turks. This gave him the possibility to interpret this threat felt by a lot of contemporaries within his framework without reducing the exceptional role of the papacy. Far more discussed in modern times and even deeper is his interpretation of the Jews. For Luther, they were not part of the image of Antichrist, but as the Antichrist, they were invoice of the devil, not as the twofold Antichrist designating the end of history, but from the beginning of history on. Whereas the Antichrist reacted to the birth and reign of Jesus Christ, the Jews, in Luther's eyes, started being in the world before Christ's birth and were enemies of the true believers from this first times on. Being this, they took part in the gallery of powers directed against God, and in so far themselves, as also the Antichrist, are connected with the devil, one can see all these as a continuation of the fear of the devil in Luther's childhood, becoming more and more differentiated by reformatory theology. But what happened with those threatening parts of God himself Luther had got to know in his religious education? Indeed, he could not neglect them absolutely. If God is almighty in the way that he not only rules over all, but even that he alone effects all that happens in the world, as Luther states, there cannot be any place for real counterparts to him. Whatever happens, also from opposing power, cannot be more than admitted by God himself. The images of a struggle between God and devil in Luther's theology are too strong to be harmonized in a theological manner explaining the devil's power as admitted and controlled by God. With no doubt, there's a possibility to do this on a very abstract level. But this means to disregard the self-reliance of those pictures that cannot be solved into a pure theological sentence. But even more, there are some hints how Luther wanted to understand negative, destructive parts in God himself. As mentioned before, there were two variants of this. One concerning God's actions, one being expressed in more ontological terms concerning the existence of God himself. The activity that shows God, even within a reformatory framework, as a destructive and punishing God, is the concept of law, and there might be the point where we can find the answer to the second question of Jim asking, why couldn't we start in Luther's theology just with mercy? There's still the word of the law. In the same way, the mystics are speaking about human being reducing him or herself to pure nothing before being fulfilled by Christ himself. Also Luther, who was very familiar with mystical theology and deeply influenced by it, had this double structure of destruction and construction man. But he separated himself from the mystical concepts by binding this process to God's word as law and gospel. But he did not stay just in this step of a development. Law could be more to him than just a verbal event. Law could be seen by God's acting in the world. He understood happenings in the nature as more than just natural, namely as expression of God's will, that was very often a punishing will, bringing catastrophes to human beings when they had failed. This deep belief into God acting in and through nature got a new framework in the doctrine of the law, but it was more than just caused by this framework. And it gave place in Luther's theology to reflections that made imaginable God not only as helping, freeing, and loving, but also as punishing and threatening. The new image of God led not simply to a complete new God, but to a God integrating constructive and destructive parts. The fear of God, learned in the youth, did not leave Luther, but it took a new place. Prepared by the mystic concepts, the fear of God was a necessary step in God's freeing way with human beings. The gospel as the word of liberation presupposed the harsh and punishing words and deeds. But even this was not enough. Luther also found a place to integrate the dark side of God into the existence of God by his famous distinction of Deus absconditus and Deus revelatus. It is not the place here to discuss this broadly disputed doctrine of the hidden and the revealed God in detail. For our purpose, it seems important to me that with this, Luther gave a place to actions and being of God that could be cruel and working against the beloved side in Jesus Christ, the Deus absconditus, the hidden God. Rebounding this to his religious education, we can see that at the end Luther corrected what he had learned by his parents in concentrating on Jesus Christ and the love of and to God. But he also let room for the other parts of God, the destructive parts, that can cause fear rightly because they cannot be understood. To take on my reflections of the beginning, Luther gave this place not in the form of imagery, but in a certain kind of not-image. The Deus absconditus, the hidden God, is not drawn, but he is something like a blank space to put all destructive parts into him. It is exactly this way that gave Luther the possibility to draw the picture of the liberating part. This was not a picture fully without negative sides, but they were integrated. There were the enemies of God and Christ responsible for a lot of harm. There was even God's harsh action in word and deed of the law. But in God himself, the obvious split was concealed by a distinction with the only sense to paint just the one positive revealed side. The dark God from the youth was beaten by this, but he was not fully abolished. Thank you very much.